Behold, my glorious supporter, isn't that right? Has requested some discussion about what I'm going to call Buildcraft Horizons. This is basically stuff that some games do for their different options for customizing your character, your playstyle, your playthrough, that I would like to see in more games or different kinds of games or used in a different way. I've tried a few takes of this one, and I think it's the most productive to talk about. I have one really good example. And then, there's a bunch of little examples. I can just briefly mention a few of them. Types of ammo as a form of flavor for when you have a ranged weapon, bows, guns, like modding in Warframe. Yeah, the mods are kind of abstract. I feel like types of bullets or arrows are less abstract. I like that as a Monster Hunter kind of thing. It just feels more tactile somehow. That I like that idea. We have locking in stats in games with randomness. This won't happen because not letting the players lock in stats lengthens the end game of those games. Now for me, I see that I can't guarantee good stats and then I just give up because I value my time. No offense to people that are interested in this, but you can take forever with it, sure. And then if they let you lock in stats, you'd stop playing sooner. So they won't do that, but it would make the games better if they did. That's all, but they're not going to. I don't know, man. Risk of Rain 2 items do a good job stacking up power-ups. Like you have a power-up where if you jump while sprinting, you move forward a little bit, and then if you have 5 of them, you move forward 5 times as far. And then not only does that let you modify your character in a pretty particular way, it also has this emerging gameplay where sometimes getting too many of them becomes bad. It loops back around to being a bad thing because you have less control over your movement. That's all really interesting. But again, I think I have a really good one. I'm going to talk about that instead, but those are some other examples of what I think would be really interesting. Before we get into that example, I do want to briefly mention that I think it's useful to consider that Buildcraft is not necessarily about letting the player customize everything. It's about letting the player customize things in a meaningful way. I think not all, but some of the best Buildcraft, some of the best customization in games comes from a well-curated basic gameplay loop, and then letting the player modify only very specific aspects of that thing to guarantee that the experience is generally solid, despite what the player chooses. And then on top of that, they can modify stuff that is rich and meaningful, not just a bunch of modifications that are all 5% more damage or whatever, a quality over quantity kind of approach. To some extent, you've seen games that really focus on quality and there's very few things you can modify. A good example of this would be Pyre. You have very, very few traits in the little talent trees, but they each make a very large impact. You really notice when you get one. That's one thing. I'm not saying that's the optimal way just because it's the maximum quality and the minimum quantity. It also isn't. You could probably go even smaller if you wanted to. But just to say that infinite quantity of decisions, being able to change anything about a game when you're build crafting something, it doesn't necessarily mean the game is just better, right? Bigger skill tree doesn't mean a better skill tree. It should be obvious when I put it that way, but whatever. Okay, so the primary thing, and again, it's hard to do this. That's why I mentioned that little caveat just now. But it's Disco Elysium's stats. Disco Elysium is an RPG, point-and-click adventure story book, I guess, audiobook, but it's a point-and-click adventure RPG. Also, it's also a little bit similar to D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, where you build a character with certain stats, certain basic amounts of charisma or intelligence or dexterity or whatever. And then they kind of go into the world and they have to roll checks to do stuff. Disco Elysium is that, I guess. But in the context of being a video game, there are some differences, and it does also take some different attitudes toward having a lot of a stat, and that's what I think is really interesting. So let me describe that. It's going to take a minute to explain how it works. So just like in Dungeons and Dragons, there are some basic stats and you can put points into them. And putting points into them makes you broadly better at things to which that applies. So for example, in D&D, you could have high strength, and that's going to make you generally better at things that involve strength. If you need to do an acrobatics check to leap over that fence or whatever, while running, you'll be better at it if you have high strength, because it's easier to be acrobatic if you're strong, right? That just makes sense. But you can also be specifically good at acrobatics. You can be generally not that strong, but a good acrobat. That's also possible, just like in real life to some degree. And Disco Elysium has that system as well. There are 4 stat categories, basically strength, dexterity, intelligence, and this one is a little bit different, but we'll just say wisdom. And then within them, there are 6 skills in each category. So similar to like in D&D. You can have a character that is broadly dexterous and good with their hands, or quick on their feet, and then also good at visual calculus. That's an intelligence one. It basically means when you look at an environment, you can sort of parse all the information and put it together and figure out what happened. You could be good at that without being broadly smart. You could be good at that one specific thing. You could just have a lot of practice. And indeed, Disco Elysium lets you do that if you want. That's cool. I already think it's a good system in D&D. It's a good system in this game. But Disco Elysium goes further in a few ways. So the first one is kind of an adaptation of something that I think is really cool in D&D, which is, in D&D you might, it's a dark night, you hear a noise in the woods, and you'll say, I want to try to look around and see what that maybe was. And your dungeon master will say, roll a perception check, and then you do. In Disco Elysium, this happens automatically. You have high visual calculus, let's say, and you're walking down the street, and there are, maybe visible in the game world, some skid trap marks from a car or something. The game, unbeknownst to you, is rolling checks in the background. It takes your visual calculus, rolls, it's 2d6 in Disco Elysium, and then if you pass the check, the game will stop you and you'll notice, whoa, it looks like something went down here, and you kind of piece it together. Because your character has high visual calculus, you're biased to view the world that way. We'll get back to that in a minute. And if you don't have high visual calculus, or you fail the roll, you have, not that high visual calculus, or you get a bad roll, you don't notice. And then maybe you come back later and you will. That mechanic is really interesting. It means you can kind of buildcraft which parts of the book that you're reading, Disco Elysium, is being read to you, that show up. And so if you're interested in more of the nitty-gritty and physical experience of being a detective in this place, that's what you do in the game. Maybe you pick dexterity and strength stuff, and you'll just notice more of that. The game, the book will essentially be edited on the fly to contain more or less of that, which is really interesting. That's something you could add to other games, where if the player becomes really good at something, the game presents challenges of that kind to you. In an action game, maybe you make a build that is good at deflecting, and in Hades, and then it might be a bummer if there aren't enemies to deflect. I think Hades is designed in a way, like most games, where they try to make sure that there just is a mix of everything. So you can't usually pick an upgrade in Hades that the game doesn't have any examples of for you to use the upgrade against. The game is designed that way. But you could design a game this other way that Disco Elysium has, where you buildcraft yourself a certain way, and then the game responds to that and throws challenges at you that are more interesting because of the decisions you made. I can't think of how specifically you would utilize that thing, but I think it's very interesting. Moving on. The big kicker here is that thing I mentioned before. In Disco Elysium, having a lot of a stat doesn't make you better at a thing, really. It makes you biased toward that thing. So, for example, there's a skill, a really good example, is in the strength category. It's kind of a body category. You have endurance. There's one that's like interrogating people. And one of them is called electrochemistry. That skill in the strength category is basically drug use or libido or horniness, sexual desire. And again, you can't really be better at doing drugs. The way to be better at doing drugs is to use drugs in moderation. Don't do drugs, kids. It makes you biased to view the world through the lens of someone who's acquainted with sex and drugs, basically. And so on the one hand, you might interrogate, there's this one guy, and extremely minor spoiler for Disco Elysium that you won't remember if you play the game because it's out of context. And you're talking to him, and if you have good electrochemistry, you'll notice, or you can roll to notice, whether he is on drugs and potentially get some of those drugs. And on the other hand, while you're walking by a trash can near that person's shop, you may, if you have high electrochemistry, just randomly get really horny. There's like a porno mag in the trash can and you see it and it just, you fixate on the thing because you have very high electrochemistry. This is not good. That's not good. Or another example would be you're in a fist fight and you have high endurance. So you interpret like someone's about to punch you as, oh, I can take it, hit me, just go ahead and hit me. But you're not actually that durable. You just view the world through the lens of being a durable person. And so you get punched and get knocked out because you're not actually, it's a bias. You're not correct, you know? It creates situations in the game where you see a reason to not build into something, or you see a consequence for specializing in something, just like in real life. If you specialize in something, you are biased to it. This is something that just in a social context, I would love if the world embraced more. Being a specialist is not just an advantage. It also makes you, you're robbed of a broad perspective, which is not good a lot of the time. It means that you, at the very least, will need some kind of reference point. And at the worst, you might be hopelessly biased and interpret things wrong because you only have that one perspective, or an unbalanced perspective. But the other thing, of course, is that it highlights this aspect of gameplay, of game design, of buildcraft that is always kind of true, but it makes it into a mechanic, which I think is kind of interesting. In games like Warframe and Hades and Genshin Impact, in every game where there are multiple multipliers. In Warframe, we have base damage and elemental damage and crits and status effects, which can represent increased damage in some way. In Hades, we have, maybe you have a cast and you make the cast do more damage, and then you get another cast gem. You have to do it in indirect ways in Hades, but you can still do it. You can make the cast crit. You can maybe recharge your casts faster, so you can throw out more of that spell that you have. And in Genshin Impact, of course, we have attack percent, damage percent, crit, maybe elemental mastery, depending on what you're doing. You have a vaporize or a melt reaction, stuff like that. And then, you know, you can get indirect ones too, like cooldown reduction. Those multipliers. It's inherently already better to blend them, to have many different multipliers rather than to just stack one up, provided that what you get is remotely similar. So for example, in Warframe, if the base damage mods gave you like 10 times more base damage, okay, I guess it would be better to just stack up base damage, because at the end of the day, you just want damage. But because they give relatively equivalent amounts, you know, you don't get so much more base damage than elemental damage or the damage represented by multi-shot, it is then inherently worth it, even if the values are slightly different. It's safe to assume that you should get a little bit of all of them. And indeed, that is how the math works in Warframe and pretty much every other game with this kind of thing. Blah, blah, blah. The point is that in Disco Elysium, there's actually a cost as part of the game to stacking up too much of that thing. But critically, it's not just negative. It basically says, oh, you want to play the game this way, that's okay, but it will come with a price. And I like that. In Warframe, there are people who are excited about just seeing a huge number on the screen. It has nothing to do with actual Warframe. In actual Warframe, it's not appropriate to, it's not relevant or effective to build for massive overkill damage. It doesn't do anything. But if people find that fun, it's not bad to try to find a way to make it enjoyable for them, right? And Disco Elysium does a good job of this, in that while it's not all good because the thing you've chosen is suboptimal, it's objectively bad from a mathematic perspective, so they're not going to make it all good, but it's interesting, like it's fun. It's not good, but it's not all bad, and it is pretty fun. It gives you this different experience of, you know, your gameplay is defined by this thing you find interesting. Again, it's Disco Elysium having this really interesting buildcraft thing where it's like the game responds to the way you want to build and then optimizes itself to give you a good experience based on how you chose to build, whatever that is. And that thing is, to me, sort of the holy grail of buildcraft, where the game can work for everyone. You know, buildcraft is about adapting the game, and really good buildcrafting games can accommodate a lot of different play styles. You can have in Hades a run where you stack up a lot of damage on one thing, and that can work. Hades is calibrated in a way where if you do it intelligently, it can work. You can just make one attack that does huge damage if that's what you really want. I would argue it's not optimal, but it's not so much worse than building in a more rounded way that you can't do it if you don't want to. The game does allow it. This is to some degree true in Warframe as well. There are, there's enough of a range of difficulties in Warframe, of levels of enemies, that if you want to, you can just pile on damage. It's just not going to work at higher levels. And again, you can see how these games kind of accommodate you doing that, but it could be better. Whereas Disco Elysium is kind of built around that. The kicker, of course, is that Disco Elysium is not about that. It's not really about buildcraft. It's got all these features that are very good buildcraft ideas. I think they are, but they're an ultimately minor part of the game, which is fine. It's not bad in Disco Elysium. It just made me think when I played it, wow, I really like this game. I would also really like a totally different game that used, or totally different gameplay that used these same systems, like an action RPG, but it used these systems instead. Makes me think of, I've played a little bit of Persona 5, and I don't think the stat system in Persona 5 or the stat systems in Persona 5 are bad at all, but I think it would be really good if they were like this as well. That would be a good system for a lot of games, and it would be hard to make. You do have to put a lot of meat on the bones of the game to adapt to what the player chooses to do, but I think it would be really interesting. And to me, it's fascinating how I think that might be one of the better or more interesting buildcraft ideas, that the game sort of, you buildcraft the whole game. It sort of rises to meet the builds that you make. That's really cool. Ironically, in a game where it doesn't, I'm not saying it has a subtle effect on Disco Elysium. It's a big deal in Disco Elysium, but it's an ultimately minor aspect of the game's design. Whereas, in another game, that could define an entire game, and I think that would be really cool. In Disco Elysium, I would say you could remove that, and much of the game's greatness is preserved. I think it's a good feature. You see it all throughout your time playing the game, but it is hardly the magnum opus of the game's design. That's all I'm trying to say. It's very cool. I'm looking forward to playing through Disco Elysium again and thinking about that more. But I think that is the best, or my favorite, if you must. Isn't that right? If you must have a single thing that I think is the most buildcraftiest idea that I would love to see all over the place. We've got a new genre term, buildcraftian. It's going to be games that are doing interesting meta stuff with developing buildcraft. It's Lovecraftian. We have buildcraftian now. Glorious. I hope that answer makes sense and is interesting. Might be a little off the wall compared to really specific game design stuff. I just feel like Disco Elysium's way of handling stats and rising to meet the player's builds is fascinating. I would love to see that in more games. I just think it's going to be complicated to figure out how games other than literally a book and you read the lines that are more interesting to the player based on what they built for. Games other than that, I think it's going to be hard to figure out how to do it, how to make that concept work in an action game. How do you accommodate for a player that has really large range? What do you do to the horde shooter in Warframe if the player is built for really long range? There might be a more interesting way to challenge them based on the fact that they have that, but what is it? Like what? I don't know, but I do think this is a really interesting concept. I hope it makes sense. Thank you very much for your glorious question.